On the 7th of August, 2020, in the middle of the deadliest pandemic in a century, a Boeing 737 full of Indian workers finally coming home from Dubai descended through a monsoon downpour toward one of the most notorious runways in Asia, a strip of pavement laid across the flattened top of a hill, with the ground falling away beyond its ends. The airline had already lost one airplane and 158 lives, off the edge of a runway exactly like this one. A safety expert had warned, in writing 9 years earlier, that landing here on this runway, in this direction, in this weather, was going to kill people. At 40 minutes past 7 that evening, almost precisely on schedule, the airplane touched down halfway along the rain-slicked runway with the wind behind it, and 21 of the people on board had less than a minute to live. This is the crash of Air India Express Flight 1344. On the evening of the 7th of August 2020, Air India Express Flight 1344, a Boeing 737-800 repatriating 184 Indian citizens stranded in Dubai by the COVID-19 pandemic, attempted to land at Kozhikode's Calicut International Airport in the driving rain of the southwest monsoon. The first approach into the wind ended in a go-around when the crew never saw the runway. The second was flown the opposite direction, downwind, downhill, onto a wet tabletop runway. And it went wrong in every way an approach can go wrong. Too high over the threshold, too fast across the ground, a long weightless float past the touchdown markers, a call of go-around from the first officer that the captain never answered. The 737 touched down 4,438 feet along a runway, only 8,858 feet long, ran off the end at 84 knots, crossed a token safety strip, and dropped down the slope at the edge of the plateau, breaking in two. 19 passengers and both pilots died. More than 100 of the survivors were injured, many gravely. What set this disaster apart was not its mechanics, which investigators reconstructed within weeks, but its biography. Everything about it had happened before, been studied before, been warned about before. In an official court of inquiry after Air India Express lost 158 people off the end of another tabletop runway in 2010. And in a written warning submitted to the government of India in 2011 that named this airport, this runway, this direction, and this weather, the story of Flight 1344 is therefore really two stories, told at two speeds. The 10 minutes in which two pilots flew a serviceable airplane off the end of a runway, and the 10 years in which an entire aviation system watched the trap being described in writing and did almost nothing. This is a story about the cost of inaction, and about who ends up paying it. Kozhikode, historically Calicut, is an ancient trading city on the Malabar coast of Kerala, in the deep southwest of India, a green and waterlogged country pressed between the Arabian Sea and the mountains of the Western Ghats. It is a region that exports people. For 2 generations, millions of Keralites have gone to work in the Gulf states, wiring money home and flying back for weddings, births, and funerals. Their airport sits not in Kozhikode itself, but at Karipur, in neighboring Malappuram district, on the only kind of land the crowded coastal belt could spare, a hilltop, its crown sliced flat by earth movers in the 1980s to make room for a runway. Aviation has a name for airports like this, tabletop. A tabletop runway occupies a plateau, natural or man-made, with terrain dropping away beyond one or both ends. In everyday operation, a tabletop is no harder to use than any other runway. The pavement is just as long and just as level. The difference is entirely in what happens when something goes wrong. At an ordinary airport, an aircraft that fails to stop on the runway rolls out into flat ground, fields, scrubland, an access road, shedding speed in an undignified but usually survivable slide. At a tabletop, the flat ground runs out where the plateau does. Beyond the end lies the edge, and beyond the edge lies the drop. Aviation's designers understood this long ago, which is why international standards call for every runway to be backed by a runway end safety area, a graded obstacle-free apron of ground, recommended to extend 240 meters beyond each end and to span a generous width, whose entire purpose is to give an overrunning aircraft room to die of friction rather than gravity. The most vulnerable airports can go further and install engineered arresting beds, crushable blocks of cellular concrete, laid where the safety area ends, that collapse under an aircraft's wheels and drag even a fast-moving jet to a stop in a few hundred feet. On a tabletop, where the penalty for an overrun is not embarrassment but a cliff, these margins are not luxuries. They are the whole difference between an incident report and a mass funeral. Calicut International Airport had a single runway, oriented 1028 southeast and northwest, measuring some 2,860 meters of pavement, of which 8,858 feet, about 2,700 meters, were available for a landing aircraft. By the standards of short-haul jets, that was adequate, though with little to spare in bad conditions. What was not adequate was everything around it. The plateau fell away steeply at the eastern end of runway 10, and the runway itself was not truly level. Past roughly its first third, the pavement of runway 10 ran perceptibly downhill, so that a jet landing long found itself decelerating on a wet downslope toward a void. India's own regulator, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, classified Kozhikode as a critical airfield, a designation reserved for the country's most demanding runways, at which only captains, never first officers, were permitted to perform takeoffs and landings. None of this was secret. It was printed on the charts, written into the manuals, and visible from the perimeter road that ran along the foot of the slope at the end of runway 10, the road onto which, one monsoon evening in 2020, a Boeing 737 would come down from the plateau the hard way. To understand why the crash of Flight 1344 provoked not just grief but fury, one has to go back 10 years and 150 kilometers up the same coast, to the city of Mangalore, because Air India Express had done all of this before. On the 22nd of May 2010, Air India Express Flight 812, a Boeing 737-800 arriving from Dubai in the small hours of the morning, approached Mangalore's runway 24, another tabletop, another plateau carved out of the hills of coastal Karnataka, with a gorge waiting beyond the far end. The captain, a Serbian expatriate named Zlatko Glušić, had slept through much of the cruise. The cockpit voice recorder captured long stretches of his snoring, and woke to fly an approach that went high and fast and refused to be salvaged. The aircraft crossed the threshold at nearly twice the standard height, touched down far along the runway, and could not stop. In the final seconds, the captain attempted the worst of all possible compromises. A go-around initiated after the thrust reversers had already been deployed. The 737 ran off the end of the tabletop, plunged into the gorge, and burned. Of the 166 people on board, 158 died. 8 passengers, scrambling from a break in the fuselage before the fire took hold, were the only survivors of what remains one of the deadliest air disasters in Indian history. The response, on paper, was everything a catastrophe is supposed to produce. A formal court of inquiry under a retired air marshal dissected the accident and issued sweeping recommendations about fatigue and crew scheduling, about the culture that made a young Indian first officer unable to stop a foreign captain from flying them both into the ground, about unstabilized approaches and the iron rule that they must end in a go-around, and, pointedly, about India's tabletop runways, their safety areas, and the special procedures that operations onto them demanded. The disaster even reshaped the machinery of investigation itself. Within 2 years, India carved its accident investigators out of the regulator's bureaucracy and created a new, nominally independent body, the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, so that the next inquiry would not involve the DGCA grading its own homework. For a moment, it looked like the system had learned. Air India Express, the low-cost international arm of the state carrier, a shoestring operation flying 737s on dense routes between southern India and the Gulf, chronically short of its own senior pilots, and dependent on secondees and contractors, promised reform. The regulator promised oversight. The airport's authority promised infrastructure. And at Kozhikode, whose runway resembled Mangalore's in every way that mattered, everyone involved had a decade's warning of exactly what was coming. They also had something better than a warning. They had a letter. Among the experts who studied the Mangalore disaster was Captain Mohan Ranganathan, a veteran airline pilot and instructor who had spent years teaching crews how to operate on wet and contaminated runways, and who now sat on a safety advisory council convened by India's Ministry of Civil Aviation. When Ranganathan looked at the lessons of Mangalore and then looked down the coast at Kozhikode, he saw the same accident waiting in the same geometry. And in June 2011, he put it in writing, in a communication to the Civil Aviation Secretary of the Government of India, the most senior aviation official in the country. His warning was not couched in generalities. Flights landing on runway 10 at Kozhikode in rain with a tailwind, he wrote, would endanger the lives of people on board. The runway, the direction, and the weather. Named 9 years in advance, and he itemized why. The safety area beyond the runway ends measured barely 90 meters, where international standards recommended 240. The graded strip flanking the runway was 75 meters wide against a recommended 100. There was no engineered arresting bed of the kind that had been stopping overrunning jets in other countries for years. The pavement carried heavy deposits of rubber that turned treacherously slick in rain. And past its first third, runway 10 sloped downhill toward the drop. His conclusion was blunt. The airport in wet conditions was simply not safe to land at, and operations in monsoon rain, above all downwind landings on runway 10, should be curtailed until it was fixed. What followed was the institutional equivalent of silence. The letter was received, acknowledged, and absorbed into the great digestive tract of Indian aviation bureaucracy, from which almost nothing emerged. The safety area was eventually improved on paper, but remained, in the eyes of its critics, a token, a short shelf of ground between the pavement and the slope, on a plateau where nothing short of an arresting bed offered real protection. No arresting bed was installed. The rubber deposits were flagged again in later inspections. Wide-body jets continued to operate. Monsoon landings on runway 10 continued. Ranganathan continued to give interviews, year after year, repeating the same warning with the weary precision of a man, reading from a script he already knew the ending of. In the years between his letter and the night it came true, tens of thousands of flights landed at Kozhikode, and the trap held its breath. It is worth pausing on how unusual this situation was. Air disasters are usually surprises, the failure mode obscure, the combination of circumstances unforeseeable. This one had been foreseen in every particular by a credentialed expert, through official channels, in writing, with the specific runway and weather named. Aviation's entire modern safety philosophy rests on the premise that identified hazards get closed before they kill. At Kozhikode, the hazard had been identified, documented, and delivered to the desk of the most powerful aviation official in India, and the system's answer, sustained across 9 years and 2 governments, was to keep landing. The airplane that finally sprang the trap arrived in the strangest year commercial aviation has ever known. By August 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic had shut the world's borders and grounded most of the world's airliners. India's own skies had gone quiet in March, but India had a problem few other countries shared at such scale. Millions of its citizens were stranded abroad, above all in the Gulf, where the pandemic's economic shock had cost vast numbers of migrant workers their jobs, their visas, and their income all at once. In May 2020, the government launched the Vande Bharat mission, the largest civilian repatriation airlift in history, and the burden of it fell disproportionately on one airline, Air India Express, whose entire reason for existing was the corridor between southern India and the Gulf. Flight 1344, from Dubai to Kozhikode on the 7th of August 2020, was one of those repatriation flights. Aboard were 184 passengers, Gulf workers coming home to Kerala, husbands and wives, elderly parents, and 10 infants, plus 2 pilots and 4 cabin crew working in the masks, gowns, and face shields of pandemic-era aviation. For many of the passengers, the ticket home had taken months of waiting lists and paperwork. For some, it had taken everything they had left. When the 737 lifted off from Dubai's runway 30 right at 2:14 in the afternoon, Gulf time, the mood in the cabin was the particular exhausted relief of people at the end of a very long ordeal, 4 hours from home. The aircraft carrying them was vt-axh, a Boeing 737-800 delivered new to Air India Express in late 2006, 13 years old, midlife for a 737, with nothing remarkable in its recent maintenance history except one small squawk that would matter enormously before the night was out. Like all of the airline's jets, it wore art on its tail. Each Air India Express aircraft carries a unique Indian-themed tail design, and vt-axh showed monuments, the India Gate on one side, the Gateway of India on the other, and it carried one more detail so pointed that a novelist would hesitate to invent it. vt-axh had been built with Boeing's Short Field Performance Package, a set of aerodynamic and control refinements designed specifically to help the 737-800 land on shorter, more demanding runways. The airplane that went off the end of the tabletop at Kozhikode was, by construction, one of the best-equipped 737s in the world for stopping in a hurry. In the cockpit that evening sat two men separated by 27 years and an ocean of status. The captain and pilot flying was Sate, 59 years old, one of the most decorated names on the Air India Express roster. Sate had come to the airline from the Indian Air Force, where, by the accounts that filled Indian newspapers in the days after the crash, he had graduated with honors, flown fighters, and served as an experimental test pilot, a résumé that commands near reverence in Indian aviation. In his civilian career, he had accumulated around 10,000 hours on the Boeing 737, some 6,662 of them in command. Kozhikode's status as a critical airfield, where only captains could land, was no obstacle to him. He had landed there at least 27 times, more than 10 of them in 2020 alone, in the thick of the monsoon repatriation schedule. If any pilot in the company could be said to know this runway, it was him. To his right sat First Officer Akhilesh Kumar, 32 years old, with a small fraction of his captain's hours and none of his aura. Kumar was, by every account, diligent and well-liked. He was also newly married, and his wife was expecting their first child. As the monitoring pilot, he could not, by regulation, have flown the landing at Kozhikode, even in perfect weather. The critical airfield rule saw to that. His job that night was the one aviation had spent 30 years learning to define: to watch, to cross-check, to call out deviations, and, if the man beside him flew them toward danger and would not stop, to intervene. It is a job that sounds straightforward in a manual. It is much harder in a cockpit where the other seat holds a 59-year-old former test pilot with 10,000 hours, in an airline, and a culture where seniority is gravity. The investigation would later describe the working atmosphere of that cockpit and of the airline around it as stiff, closed, and steep. An environment in which hierarchy did the talking and juniors learned to phrase their alarm as politeness. Both men would have recognized the description. Neither would live to read it. Every year from June to September, the southwest monsoon parks itself over Kerala and rains with a persistence that visitors struggle to comprehend. Not storms passing through, but a season-long atmospheric river, with cloudbursts embedded in it like stones in a current. Kozhikode in August operates inside this machine. Rain at the airport is not weather, it is the default. And rain transforms the physics of the one maneuver an airliner cannot refuse: the landing. A jet stops on a runway through friction, tires gripping pavement, converted to deceleration by wheel brakes, assisted by spoilers that dump the wing's lift and press the aircraft down, and by thrust reversers that redirect engine exhaust forward. Water attacks the first and most important link in that chain. A film of water lubricates the tire-pavement interface. Deep enough water, met at high enough speed, can lift the tires off the pavement entirely. Aquaplaning, reducing braking to almost nothing. Rubber deposits, the black glaze laid down in the touchdown zone by thousands of previous landings, make it worse, turning wet pavement into something closer to wet glass. Pilots are trained to assume that a wet runway may double the distance a landing consumes, and to add margin accordingly. Then there is the wind. Aircraft land into the wind for a reason so fundamental it predates powered flight. A headwind reduces the aircraft's speed across the ground, and it is ground speed, not airspeed, that the brakes must destroy. Reverse the arithmetic, and every knot of tailwind is a knot of extra ground speed at touchdown. And stopping distance grows with the square of speed. A 737 crossing the threshold with 15 knots on its tail is not 15 knots worse off. It is hundreds of meters worse off before the first drop of rain is counted. This is why Air India Express, like most operators, capped tailwind landings at 10 knots, and why runway 28 at Kozhikode, pointing into the monsoon's prevailing westerlies, was the runway of choice in August, even though landing on 28 meant accepting the plateau's other quirks. Landing the opposite way on runway 10 meant taking the monsoon on the tail onto wet rubber-glazed pavement, downhill toward the edge. It was precisely the combination Mohan Ranganathan had named in his letter. The airline knew all of this, and its own rulebook said so. Air India Express's monsoon procedures limited crews to 2 approaches. If the second attempt failed, diversion was mandatory, whatever the fuel state. And fuel on this night was never the problem. Flight 1344 carried enough to reach its alternates comfortably. a fact India's civil aviation minister would confirm within a day of the crash. What the flight did not carry a reserve of was schedule. In the compressed, exhausting rhythm of the repatriation airlift, an aircraft that diverted tonight was an aircraft out of position tomorrow, a canceled flight, 180 stranded people somewhere else. None of that pressure appears in any regulation. All of it rides along in the cockpit. The flight from Dubai was, for 3.5 hours, entirely without incident. All times that follow are local Indian time. At 6:49 p.m., as the 737 crossed the subcontinent's coast in the last of the daylight, Chennai Control passed down the Kozhikode weather. Runway 28 in use, visibility 1,500 meters in moderate thunderstorm and rain, surface wind from 270 degrees at 14 knots. It was ugly but legal. The minimum visibility for the ILS at Kozhikode was 1,300 meters, and it was exactly what August in Kerala was supposed to look like. Captain Satay briefed the approach to runway 28 before starting down. The briefing, the investigators would note, covered that approach and nothing else. No discussion of what they would do if the runway changed. No contingencies. The landing flap and autobrake settings settled with barely a word exchanged between the two pilots. It was the briefing of a man who had done this 27 times before. One other detail rode down the descent with them. Before departure, the crew had been told, informally, of a problem with the aircraft's windshield wipers, a defect that appeared nowhere in the technical log, and therefore officially did not exist. Descending into the wall of monsoon cloud over Kerala, Satay's mind went to it. "You just check that this works," he told Kumar over the sound of the rain finding the windshield. On an approach to minimums in a downpour, the wipers were about to become the most important piece of equipment on the airplane. At 7:14 p.m., overhead the Calicut beacon, Flight 1344 was cleared for the ILS approach to runway 28. The crew skipped a pre-approach announcement that the airline's monsoon procedures made mandatory. A small omission, but a telling one, the first thread of procedure to come loose. Down the glide slope they came, into rain that hammered the airframe and swallowed the approach lights. The runway somewhere ahead in the gray. It never appeared. At minimums, there was nothing outside the windshield but water, and Satay pushed the thrust levers forward and went around. One approach gone. Under the airline's monsoon rules, they had exactly one more. If it failed, diversion was mandatory, and the fuel to divert was sitting in the tanks. Somewhere below, at airports called Kannur and Kochi and Coimbatore, dry runways waited. Flight 1344 would visit none of them. As the 737 climbed away, the crew asked the tower for the numbers that would decide everything: visibility, winds, and the position of the thunderstorm cells. The answer came back: visibility 2,000 meters. Wind from 260 degrees at 5 knots, storm cells all around the airfield at 2,500 feet, and in that answer lay a temptation. If the wind was really only 5 knots, then its tail component on the reciprocal runway was trivial, and runway 10, unlike runway 28, might be approachable through a gap in the cells. The crew of Flight 1344 accepted runway 10 almost immediately. The investigators would use the word hasty. No proper briefing of the new approach, no review of its very different threats, and critically, no calculation of the landing distance required, the arithmetic that would have laid the trap out in plain figures. Wet runway, downslope, tailwind 8,858 feet. It was mandatory, it was never done. There was one more quiet decision with long consequences. Discussing the landing configuration. The pilots chose flaps 30 rather than the flaps 40 they had first considered, reasoning that the lesser setting would ride the expected turbulence more smoothly. It would, and it would also cross the threshold faster and float farther, on a night when every knot and every foot were already spoken for. At 7:38 p.m., the tower cleared Flight 1344 to land on runway 10. Visibility 2,000 meters in light rain, runway surface wet, wind from 250 degrees at 8 knots. What the tower did not pass on, then or ever, was that its own instruments were now showing the wind considerably stronger than that, a failure the investigation would single out. The true tailwind component awaiting the 737 was around 15 knots, half again the company's legal maximum, and the aircraft's own instruments were already telling the tale to anyone who compared two numbers, established on the ILS at 7:39 p.m. and only fully established Autopilot and autothrottle engaged at 633 feet, barely 300 feet above the ground. Itself a violation of every definition of a stabilized approach, the 737 showed 150 knots of airspeed and roughly 175 knots across the ground. 25 knots of the monsoon were pushing them at the runway. At 500 feet, Captain Satay clicked off the autopilot to fly the landing by hand, leaving the autothrottle engaged. Almost at once, the approach began to shed its remaining discipline. The nose dropped, the descent rate spiked briefly to 500 feet per minute, 3 times a comfortable value that close to the ground, and Kumar called the excessive sink not once but twice. Satay corrected, then overcorrected, the 737 now surfing the gusts under the storm cells. Wipers flailing at the rain, the aircraft crossed the runway 10 threshold at 92 feet instead of the standard 50, high, fast, and moving over the wet pavement at a ground speed that belonged to a departure, not an arrival. Then, in the last seconds before the wheels should have met the runway, the still engaged autothrottle nudged the engines up in a brief surge of power, and Satay flared early and aggressively, and the Boeing, light on its wings, simply refused to land. What the cockpit voice recorder preserved of the next 15 seconds is brief and terrible in its brevity. As the 737 floated weightless down the runway, past the 1,000-foot markers, past the aiming point, past 500 feet with the wheels still in the air, First Officer Kumar did the thing the entire modern doctrine of the two-pilot cockpit exists for. He called go around. Under the airline's own rules, the call was not advice. It was a command, and compliance was mandatory. From the left seat came no answer at all. The lights marking the end of the touchdown zone, 3,000 feet from the threshold, slid beneath the nose with the aircraft still flying. 3 seconds before the wheels finally touched, Kumar tried once more. Not a command now, barely a question. What investigators would describe as a feeble, uncomfortable call of, "Captain," the sound of a 32-year-old first officer watching a legend fly them off the end of a runway, and unable to find the words to stop him. The main wheels touched at 4,438 feet, very nearly the halfway point of the 8,858-foot runway, at 165 knots across the ground, with 15 knots of wind behind them, on wet pavement, at the top of the downslope, in the rain, in the dark. From that spot, on that surface, at that speed, the mathematics had already closed. There were about 4,400 feet of runway left, and the airplane needed more than that no matter what anyone did now. The only question the remaining seconds would decide was how it left the plateau. Even then, the 737 fought for its people. The spoilers rose. The wheels spun up and the anti-skid went to work on the streaming pavement. But in the crucial first seconds, the deceleration was squandered. The thrust reversers cracked open. And then, before they could bite into the aircraft's momentum, they were stowed again. And as the reverser levers came back, the brake pressure momentarily slackened with them, easing the aircraft's grip on the runway at the moment it needed it most. Whether that stowing was indecision, the reflex of a man considering one last leap back into the sky, or something else, the recorders preserved the action and not the intention. Only late in the rollout did full reverse thrust and full braking finally arrive together. The engines howling against 70 tons of momentum on wet glass, the end lights rushing up out of the rain. It was not enough, and here the investigation would deliver its most haunting finding. Simulations showed that from the point where Flight 1344 touched down in that night's conditions, no crew on Earth could have stopped the aircraft on the runway. But if maximum braking and full reverse had been applied within 2 seconds of touchdown, the 737 would have run off the end at a crawl and halted on the level ground beyond, bruised and embarrassed and intact. Nobody aboard would have been so much as scratched. The margin between an anecdote and a mass casualty disaster that night was a few seconds of hesitation on top of everything else. At about 7:41 in the evening, 1 minute past its scheduled arrival time, Air India Express Flight 1344 departed the end of runway 10 at 84 knots. It crossed the short safety strip in around 2 seconds, shedding almost no speed on the sodden grass, reached the place where the tabletop stopped, and went over. The slope beyond dropped away roughly 35 feet toward the airport's perimeter road, and the 737 went down it nose first into the dark. The forward fuselage struck the ground below and crumpled, the cockpit absorbing the worst of an impact it had spent the whole flight trying to prevent. The fuselage broke in two just behind it, and the wreck slid to a stop at the foot of the slope beside the road in the rain. And then, the mercy on which every survivor's life turned, nothing caught fire. The tanks had ruptured into a world already soaked by weeks of monsoon, the downpour smothering every spark, and the wreck of Flight 1344 lay broken and dark and quiet at the bottom of the hill, full of the living and the dead, as the rain came down and the first headlights appeared on the perimeter road. The first rescuers were not rescuers at all. They were the people of Khandadi and the villages around Karipur, shopkeepers, students, auto rickshaw drivers, men walking home through the rain who heard the sound from the plateau and ran toward it, in the dark, in a downpour, in the middle of a pandemic that had taught the whole world to stay away from strangers. They came over the perimeter road with phone torches and umbrellas and bare hands, and they climbed into the broken halves of a Boeing 737 full of injured people and began pulling them out. Within minutes they were joined by the airport's fire crews and the paramilitary police who guard Indian airports, and then by a fleet of ambulances and commandeered private cars that turned every road between Karipur and the hospitals of Kozhikode and Malappuram into a single soaked artery of headlights. The cabin crew, all four of whom survived, worked the evacuation from inside. The villagers worked it from outside, and between them, in filthy weather on a collapsing slope, they emptied the aircraft with a speed that almost certainly saved lives, because no one that night could be sure the wreck would not still burn. The human ledger of Flight 1344 closed at 21 dead, 19 passengers, and both pilots killed in the forward fuselage that had taken the impact for everyone behind it. 110 of the survivors were injured, dozens of them critically, filling operating theaters across 2 districts through the night. And there was a bitter pandemic postscript. In the days that followed, a number of the volunteers who had climbed into the wreck without a moment's hesitation tested positive for the virus they had ignored in order to do it. Kerala noticed. In a year with little to celebrate, the people of Khandadi became, briefly and deservedly, famous. The task of explaining the disaster fell to the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, the independent agency that India had created in the aftermath of Mangalore precisely so that the next tabletop catastrophe would be investigated beyond the regulator's shadow. Flight 1344 was the first major accident of the AAIB's existence. The institution born from the previous Air India Express overrun would cut its teeth on the sequel. The flight recorders were pulled from the wreck the next day and flown to Delhi, and they gave up their story without resistance. The engines had run perfectly. The flight controls, brakes, spoilers, and hydraulics had all answered. Nothing on vt-axh had failed except the decisions made in its cockpit and the system wrapped around them. The final report, released on the 11th of September 2021, ran to hundreds of pages and 43 safety recommendations. But its probable cause fit in a sentence. The captain had continued an unstabilized approach and landed beyond the touchdown zone, halfway down the runway, despite a go-around call from the first officer that made breaking off the landing mandatory. And the first officer, having made the call, had not taken the controls and executed the go-around himself when his captain ignored it. Around that core, the investigators arranged the contributing rings, the 15-knot tailwind, half again the legal limit which the tower had failed to update even as its own instruments showed the wind rising, the wet, rubber-glazed, downsloping runway, the hasty acceptance of runway 10 without briefing or landing distance calculation, the flap setting chosen for comfort over stopping power, the defective windshield wipers that officially did not exist because the defect had never been entered in the technical log, and the thrust reversers deployed, stowed, and deployed again while the runway ran out. But the report's most important pages were about none of these things. They were about the silence in the cockpit. Akhilesh Kumar had seen the approach come apart. He called the sink rate. He anticipated the long landing. He made the go-around call that his airline's own rules defined as an order. And then, as the order went unanswered, he subsided. 3 seconds before touchdown, all that remained of the modern first officer's mandate was that small, strangled, "Captain." The investigators traced the failure past the man to the environment that made him, an airline, and a wider culture, in which hierarchy and seniority governed the flight deck, and in which a junior pilot confronted with a celebrated senior displayed, in the report's words, a meek and unassertive demeanor at exactly the moments when assertion was the only thing that could have saved everyone. It was Mangalore's cockpit, reconstructed line by line. 10 years later, the same steep gradient, the same one-man airplane, the same second pilot reduced to a witness. Aviation had spent those 10 years worldwide, teaching first officers to take the controls from captains who would not listen. At Air India Express, the report concluded the lesson had never truly landed, and the AAIB went further, in a sentence that transformed a crash report into an indictment. The steady drumbeat of similar accidents and incidents across Indian aviation, and within Air India Express above all, pointed, it said, to systemic failures that no finding against 2 dead pilots could explain away. Which brings the story back to the letter, because the true scandal of Flight 1344 is not that it happened, but that every element of it had been described, in official writing, years in advance, and priced at zero. Consider the ledger. In 2010, a court of inquiry into 158 deaths at Mangalore recommended reform of tabletop operations, of unstabilized approach discipline, of cockpit culture, of fatigue and oversight at Air India Express. In 2011, Mohan Ranganathan's letter to the Civil Aviation Secretary named Kozhikode's runway 10 in rain, with a tailwind as a killer in waiting, and itemized the airport's deficiencies. A safety area barely a third of the recommended length, an undersized strip, heavy rubber contamination, a downslope toward the drop, and no arresting bed. Across the following 9 years, the warnings were repeated in audits, interviews and safety forums with numbing regularity. Nothing decisive was done. The arresting bed was never installed. Monsoon landings on runway 10 continued. Wide-body jets kept operating onto the plateau, right up until the 8th of August 2020, when, with 21 people dead at the bottom of the slope, the authorities suspended wide-body operations at Kozhikode virtually overnight. It was proof, delivered a day too late, of the thing campaigners had said all along. The system had always been capable of acting. It had simply chosen not to, until the cost of inaction was lying in a rubber field beside the perimeter road. The aftermath ran along grimly familiar lines. A lawyer named Yeshwant Shenoy, who had spent years suing for safer airports, went to the Kerala High Court seeking to shut Calicut down entirely, and accused the regulator of negligence stretching back past Mangalore. Pilot associations erupted at the head of that regulator, whose first public reflections on the disaster managed to be both premature and dismissive of the dead crew. Experts asked publicly whether an inquiry answering to the same ministry that had ignored the 2011 letter could ever follow the failure all the way to the top. And Ranganathan himself gave the bleakest interviews of all. A man who had spent a decade being right, discovering that being right had never been the obstacle. The obstacle was that in the institutions responsible, a written warning weighed less than the inconvenience of acting on it. 179 people had now died off the ends of Air India Express runways in a decade. The paperwork predicting both accidents would have fit in a single folder. The report's 43 recommendations went out to the airline, the airports authority, and the regulator. And in the years immediately afterward, change did come, in the uneven, announcement-heavy way that change comes to Indian aviation. Crew resource management programs were overhauled with explicit attention to the authority gradient that had silenced Akhilesh Kumar. Simulator training gained modules on tabletop runways, tailwind landings, and monsoon operations. Flight data monitoring was sharpened to hunt for long landings before they became overruns. Duty time rules were revisited in acknowledgement of the exhaustion baked into the repatriation era. The wide-body ban at Kozhikode held. The deeper fixes moved more slowly, where they moved at all. Years after the crash, the plateau at Karipur still ended the way it always had, in a short shelf of grass, and then the edge, and the arresting bed that experts had begged for since 2011 remained an item on a list. In Kerala, the accounting was more personal. Captain Deepak Sathe was cremated with the honors due a decorated airman, mourned by a service community that struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the approach the recorders described, a grief complicated, as it always is, by the knowledge that the same decisions that ended his life ended 20 others. First Officer Akhilesh Kumar went home to a family that included a child he would never meet, born after his death to carry his name forward. The 19 passengers were mourned across the Gulf worker villages of Malabar, in households that had spent months fighting to bring them home and received them at last in circumstances no one should have to imagine. And at Kandadi, the villagers who had emptied the wreck in the rain quietly recovered from the virus and from everything else and went back to living beside the hill. The monsoon comes back to Kerala every June, as it always has, and the rain falls on the plateau at Karipur exactly as it fell on the evening of the 7th of August 2020. Jets still descend through it toward the tabletop, wipers beating, crews briefing the numbers that two men once declined to calculate. Somewhere in the files of the Ministry of Civil Aviation sits a letter from June 2011 that told the future with the precision of prophecy, and beside it now sits a report from September 2021 confirming, in 43 recommendations, that the prophecy had been correct in every detail. Between those two documents lie 21 funerals, 110 hospital beds, a child who knows his father only from photographs, and a simple, terrible arithmetic that aviation exists to refuse, that it was cheaper year after year to do nothing. The crash of Flight 1344 lasted a little under a minute. From the go-around call, nobody answered to the silence at the bottom of the slope. The choosing of it took 10 years and was made again and again by people who never had to ride in the back.